Today, we are particularly happy to welcome Professor Caroline Levine to present her lecture entitled A Tale of Three Pipelines Looking in the Future. Caroline is David and Kathleen Ryan Professor of the Humanities at Cornell University. She is a prominent literary scholar, a prolific writer, an interdisciplinary thinker, and climate activist. She has written 4 books, including the award-winning Forms, Whole Rhythm Hierarchy Network, and her most recent wonderful, truly inspiring book, The Activist Humanist, Form and Method in the Climate Crisis. In her work, Caroline invites us to explore, but more importantly, to act on many urgent and pressing problems and questions of our time. What can we do as scholars, activists, as human beings in the face of the climate crisis and social inequality? How can we mobilize our aesthetic, social, and political powers and tools to fight for climate and social justice? And what forms, infrastructures, networks, and routines can sustain our collective life into the future? And I think that many of these questions resonate very deeply with the possibility studies community and with our collective effort of trying to understand what possibilities do we actually have to build a more just, more sustainable, and more peaceful world. So thank you so much, Caroline. A very warm welcome, and it is wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you so much. I'm really so honored to be here and to know a little bit more about this network, which is very exciting and which I will be tuning into in the future for sure. Before I start, Ksenia, could you just tell me, I have a bar across the top of my screen that says this meeting is being recorded, which I seem not to be able to get rid of. Is that in the way? Can you see it?
No, we don't see that. No, we just see your PowerPoint. Yes, yes.
I won't worry about it. All right, so I will launch it. I'm delighted to be here in part because interdisciplinary audiences help me to think about the big question that I've been asking for a number of years, which is how the humanities in particular can help us to think about how to respond to the climate crisis. And one of the things that people often say the humanities have to offer is that they open us up to possibilities, right? And that they free us to think the world otherwise. And artworks are particularly valuable, people say, because they're complex and ambiguous and open-ended, because they don't have a particular agenda or plan or program. So the general idea is that when we're looking at a painting or we're reading a poem, we aren't just rushing around trying to get things done. We're stopping business as usual and allowing our imaginations to wander and roam free, and we can reflect and wonder and imagine. Thinkers across the humanities argue that this kind of interruption of business as usual is especially urgent right now, at a historical moment when corporations and governments are pushing us to turn every aspect of our lives into financial profit. So I do agree with this argument, but a few years ago, as the climate crisis was accelerating, I started to worry about it also, this idea of the imagination of imaginations being set free by works of art. It started to trouble me that the insistence on ambiguity and open-endedness in particular might prompt humanists to avoid focusing on planning and building and reinforce the notion, and let's see, that we shouldn't do anything at all in response to the climate crisis. So you may know this book, How to Do Nothing. It's the kind of book that suggests that artists and humanists shouldn't try to organize and plan and build, but instead should just stay in this kind of open-ended space. So what if we're disempowering ourselves by insisting that the best that we have to offer is pausing and open-ended questioning instead of planning for the future? What if the humanities have knowledge that could help us to halt the climate crisis and we're not using it? So this talk will have 4 parts, and the first is really to focus on open-endedness. And what I think might be the limits of this value of open-endedness right now. The second is to think about endings, and particularly happy endings, which humanists and artists have been very skeptical of. So to move from open-endedness to its opposite, endings. Third, to think about a method that we might use to rethink our methods, our ways of approaching questions of endings and open-endedness, which is formalism, the method that I'm most closely associated with. And then fourth, and this is actually the bulk of the talk, is to think about three pipelines in formalist terms. So let me start with open-endedness. I myself wrote 3 books that took the value of open-endedness so much for granted that it took me a long time even to imagine a different framework. But in our own historical context, the more I've thought about open-endedness as a value, the more troubling it seemed to me. First of all, as fossil fuels disrupt lives around the world with storms, floods, droughts, and wildfires, people's lives have gotten more open-ended, but not in a good way. So when you're not sure where to find your next meal or a safe place to sleep, ambiguity and uncertainty about what's going to happen next are probably not primarily a source of pleasure and excitement. So words like predictability and security have been dismissed by artists and humanists for more than a century, but it seems to me that they've also been much too easy for the privileged to take for granted. If your home or your food or water sources are doubtful and precarious, it's exactly predictability and security that you're going to be longing for. Then in recent years, this worry started to intensify because the open-endedness so beloved of the humanities has become uncomfortably consonant with injustice. A world unconstrained by regulation, for example, is one of the great dreams of authoritarian populist leaders around the world who are breaking rules and undoing institutions and radically questioning business as usual. So the Trump administration, for example, enjoyed breaking free from all kinds of regulations, including 100 environmental rules, fracking on indigenous lands, drilling in wildlife preserves, and dumping toxins in waterways. Climate denialism itself has a lot in common with the humanistic value of open-endedness. So historians Naomi Oreskes and Eric M. Conway worked through the archives of the fossil fuel companies to discover that back in the 80s, these companies knew that fossil fuels would cause unprecedented destruction, but they wanted to keep selling oil anyway. So they conducted a public campaign that was focused on doubt and skepticism around climate science, and implicitly all about open-endedness. So the idea was to keep focusing on a debate that was not closed, that we didn't know the answer to. And it's important to wait for more studies, they said, before taking any kind of public action. So these so-called merchants of doubt succeeded in making lots of people think that the best response to climate change was to pause and wonder rather than to know and to take action. Tech companies, too, have been big fans of open-ended and exciting futures, and they are always claiming to free work from traditional norms like cubicles and schedules. But as we know, this kind of open-endedness has also brought with it a terrible precarity for much of the labor force, as workers, including contingent faculty around the world, struggle to make ends meet by stringing together multiple unpredictable gigs. Now, I don't mean to say that humanists in love with open-endedness should be blamed for the climate crisis, or to suggest that we should stop teaching or enjoying challenging and ambiguous works of art. But I do think that stability is too easy to devalue or overlook for those who have it, and I want to make the case that this crucial value in the humanities is now getting in the way of the kinds of political action that could address the ravages of climate change. So I'd like to explore an example of the ways that I think the humanities might shift our attention and our values in the climate crisis. And that's why I want to go to the opposite of open-endedness, which is endings. And there's probably no form that has drawn more contempt from literary scholars than happy endings to novels and movies. They teach us to be complacent. They don't get us to think, right? These are the things that we say about happy endings. So the idea is that, if everything's wrapped up really nicely, we don't have to do anything to change the world. We don't even have to think hard about it. And we can just feel peaceful at the end of a movie or a novel with a happy ending. But I want to spend a little time rethinking happy endings, because I think that helps us to understand the problems with open-endedness too. So one major problem with happy endings, according to the critics, is that they end up reinforcing social norms and exclusions. So for the traditional happy ending of romantic plots, for example, all kinds of queer and other homoerotic desires have to be excluded. And for the happy endings of mystery and detective stories, a criminal has to be caught and taken out of society so that everything can return to normal, which implies the need for police and state surveillance. And that's why most literary critics are deeply skeptical of what we call closure. That is what brings a story to an end. But critics have not focused a lot of attention on the specific kinds of plots that have been drawing my own political attention in the climate crisis. And those are narratives that are propelled by hunger and homelessness. I call these plots of precarity. The 19th century novel is full of these, so Oliver Twist is probably the most famous. The plot gets going in earnest when Oliver, quote, desperate with hunger and reckless with misery, dares to ask for more food. The plot of Zola's Germinal turns on the struggle for bread. Dostoevsky's Poor Folk is another example, as is de Lizardi's El Periquillo Sarmiento, the mangy parrot, said to be the first novel published in Latin America, with a very devious protagonist who's always trying to get money for food and shelter. So what happens after we follow these precarious protagonists for many pages? We get endings that specifically promise a future of predictable food and shelter. I want to focus on the example of George Moore's Esther Waters from 1894. And this is not a very widely read novel. I really recommend it if you are interested in it. And Moore is an Irish writer, so the Dublin, those in Dublin might be especially interested in this novel. So Esther is a very precarious character, and through the novel, we follow her through all kinds of troubles, including a baby out of wedlock, an abusive stepfather, unemployment, the workhouse, and trouble with the police. At the very end, though, a widowed Esther falls into a life of regularity with her employer. Quote, in the evening, they sat in the library sewing, or Mrs. Barfield read aloud, or they talked of their sons. On Sundays, they had their meetings, and that is religious meetings. So now we're in the smooth final stage of the novel. And Esther's employer asks her at this point if she'd like to marry, and she says, marry and begin life over again? All the worry and bother over again? Why should I marry? In place of the worry and bother of the marriage plot, the two women agree to work on to the end. So you can see the words repeat themselves in a way that suggests that this is just going to be a life of sameness, everything the same over and over again. So this is not a plot or an adventure, this ending, but it's also not closure in the sense of bringing all action to an end. For Esther, it's the first genuine prospect of a sustainable life stretching on into the future. So the promise of reliable food and the regular rituals of labor and religious observance. And Moore is very clear that it's not marriage that's going to bring about this stable ending for women. Instead, he insists on the importance of work and meals and social routines that sustain bodies and communities over time. So the happy endings of plots of precarity invite us to pay a deliberate attention to ongoingness, the project of sustaining life over time. These endings don't bring all action to a close, as the term closure suggests. Instead, what they show us are these stable routines extending into the future predictably. So the ending in this sense is more like a transition to a new state, the promise of a secure and sustainable life, than it is an enclosure, like the word closure suggests. Or to put it another way, closure is continuity. And that's politically interesting because continuity is exactly what I think we need to be valuing right now in our own time, as the steady flow of clean water, nutritious food, and stable shelter are all increasingly rare and under threat. The thinker who best articulates the political importance of continuity is, in my mind, is Indigenous philosopher Kyle Powys White, who coins the term collective continuance. For White, it's unjust to disrupt the ways that different communities thrive and maintain themselves over time, including the ways that they gain access to clean water and sustain food systems. And justice is allowing people to figure out how to allow their own groups sovereignty to decide how they're going to sustain themselves over time into the future. Now, as soon as I started shifting my own focus toward collective continuance, I stopped defaulting to open-endedness, and I started revaluing stability, predictability, continuity, all values I've spent my whole professional life rejecting. And instead of calling for an unknowable world to come, this kind of open-ended imagination, I started thinking about the hard work of building and maintaining stable conditions for collective life. So, how could humanistic thinking help us to take meaningful action to sustain collective life in the midst of the climate crisis? My own argument is that we should be making use of a method that has a long history in the humanities and in other disciplines too. That's an approach that I call formalism. In literary studies, in musicology, and in art history, the word form usually refers to the shapes, patterns, and structures that organize works of art and literature, like poetic meter or vanishing point perspective. I myself deliberately define form more broadly than that as any shape or configuration of materials, any arrangement of elements, any ordering or patterning. So according to this definition, politics is very much a matter of form. So if you think about political battles over spatial boundaries, those are forms around space, but we also contest organizations of time. And then we experience, and these are some of the worst political forms, hierarchical divisions. In this sense, politics is all about distributions and arrangements, or to put this in my own terms, politics is the work of giving form to collective life. Now, it's absolutely true that many political forms, including racial hierarchies and national boundaries, are oppressive and violent. And it's because of forms like these that lots of radical thinkers have wanted to say that all forms should be resisted. That's the politics of open-endedness, right? Is that you should resist all constraints. And I think there's a kind of dream of a freedom from all form that's at the heart of libertarian impulses on both right and left. But that goes against something we know about living in common. All human communities depend on orderings, shapings, and arrangements just for the ordinary project of day-to-day survival, like routines of food and rest, pathways for water and waste, and sheltering enclosures. And it's my argument that scholars of the arts have the methods to make sense of the various forms that give shape to collective life. So just as we track the intersections of rhyme and syntax and metrical form in a poem, we can analyze the routines, the pathways, and the enclosures that structure the social world. To some of the critics of my work, this expansion of formalism has sounded grandiose or even delusional. But my own argument is specifically methodological. That is, just as a historian can study lots of different aspects of life, from the causes of the Russian Revolution to changing medieval childbirth practices, or just as a statistician can count lots of different patterns and arrangements from microbes to stars, a formalist can focus on patterns and arrangements to analyze the plot of the novel or the arrangement of a social hierarchy. And in fact, I want to point out that a movement back and forth between literary and social forms is actually a pretty ordinary practice in literary studies and also in art history. No one is surprised, for example, when a literary scholar reads the jolting rhythms of language in a text in relation to social forms like railway travel or urban streets or modern machinery. So we move back and forth between literary and social forms all the time. So I've taken the critiques of my work very seriously, but they still haven't persuaded me that we can't use formalist methods to interpret all kinds of shaped and patterned things, including social hierarchies and transportation systems. These aren't aesthetic in the usual sense, but they're designed and made things. The social world is filled with well-wrought forms. And it does seem to me that these methods don't belong just to literary studies or art history. There's a kind of formalism or structuralism across many fields. And so in a certain way, it's a kind of extra-disciplinary method. Anyone who pays attention to structures and patterns can perform this method. And it seems to me that formalist methods have what we need to design better and more just and sustaining social worlds. So then the question is, which forms are best for collective continuance? And this is a hard question. In part, I think across my work, I've argued that most forms have multiple affordances. So you can't just classify any form as either good or bad. So Ksenia and I were talking about the fact that the Possibilities Group has one in-person conference and one online conference. An in-person conference might be better because we get face-to-face, but it's also exclusive because people who can't afford to travel or don't have access can't go, right? Online forums are better for bringing in lots of people, but then they don't have the affordances of the face-to-face. So good and bad. This is true of happy endings also. So some happy endings do reinforce oppressive norms, but others can give shape to longings for continuity and lead us precisely to revalue the kinds of forms of collective continuance that are under threat right now, like housing and food security. I've also come to see happy endings as a crucial form for successful activist struggle, so outside of the realm of the arts and in the realm of social action. If we take the famous example of the Montgomery bus boycott in the US in the late 1950s, this was a 13-month nonviolent protest against segregated busing. The organizers knew that the boycott would be long, and it had to last long enough both to shift public sympathies and to wear down the opposition. But it was going to be trouble to keep lots and lots of people going through this long slog. So how are they going to do that? Civil rights lawyer Fred Gray says, quote, people must have something to look forward to. So it was this idea of a happy ending that gave collective meaning and purpose to the arduous daily work of boycotting. And that was inspiring to people to keep going, even when the going was really hard. So this is a case where the ending does not only reinforce the status quo or make us feel complacent or stick with what we already have. It didn't make people complacent at all, because in fact, winning in Montgomery was an inspiration to lots of other activists across the US South to fight against Jim Crow laws. So happy endings can even foster other activist movements. So what I'm thinking these days is that endings are neither good nor bad intrinsically, but they can be politically useful forms in two ways. First, they can teach us to yearn for the stable material conditions necessary for collective continuance. And second, they can afford energizing goals for activists engaged in the hard work of social struggle. So now what I want to do is to think, I'm going to use formalist methods, which I learned from studying literature, to analyze the form of the pipeline and keep going with this question of forms being neither intrinsically good or bad, but allowing us to analyze social forms so we can think about what kinds of social worlds they help us to build. As forms, pipelines are usually tubular in shape, and they afford the continuous flow of liquids or gases. Pipelines do start in one place and end in another place, but their beginnings and endings aren't usually dramatic or definitive. They make stops along the way too, but what they most importantly afford is continuity or flow. So the end is not the point. The pipeline as a form is a little like the endless endings of plots of precarity. It's just to keep going smoothly and predictably into the distant future. There are at least three important ways that oil and gas pipelines afford terrible injustices. First, they're often planned to run through communities of color and indigenous treaty territories, destroying lands and waterways that are crucial to collective continuance. Second, oil and gas pipelines present serious risk to life and health. On the one hand, enormous greenhouse gas emissions, but also 760,000 barrels of oil run through Enbridge's Line 3 every day, crossing 200 bodies of water. So if Line 3 leaked under the Mississippi River, it would poison water that literally millions of people rely on. And these kinds of accidents happen all the time. The most famous is probably BP's Gulf of Mexico oil rig explosion. The oil rig won a safety award on the same day that this explosion set off a fire that couldn't be put out and left the well gushing oil deep underwater for basically endlessly till there was no oil left. So first of all, destruction of communities of color. Second of all, global warming and toxic spills and leaks. Those are the most obvious problems with pipelines. But I want to spend a little time with the third reason to object to pipelines, which is what interests me most about the forum from the perspective of focusing on the future. And that's the way that pipelines impose order on time. So I'm going to use the example here of the Pacific Northwest fracked gas pipeline in the US, which has just gotten the go-ahead for expansion. And I want to focus in particular on the words that Washington Governor Jay Inslee uses to object to the pipeline. He says, "This decision essentially locks in long-term capital investments that prevent us from reaching our national and state climate goals. It makes no sense to shackle ourselves to a source of energy whose cost will go up in the coming decades." So Inslee is saying that an expanded pipeline locks us in. It shackles us to fossil fuels. And he's right. Once fossil fuel infrastructures are in the ground, it becomes much harder to shift to renewable alternatives. So investors balk at closing down a multi-million-dollar investment before it's been paid off. And when gas is the norm, wind and solar stay outliers and are expensive hassles for consumers to kind of go out of their way to install. So infrastructural investments are ways of ensuring that oil and gas remain the default setting while renewables stay pricier and more inconvenient. The term for this is carbon lock-in. That is new infrastructure that commits us to fossil fuels for its lifetime. So the Pacific Northwest pipeline has a life expectancy of around 50 years, and here are some other life expectancies of fossil fuel infrastructures. So on the one hand, one of the crucial affordances of pipelines as forms is continuity over long periods. On the other hand, this analysis can help us to think about how we might stop pipelines. So this analysis has given shape to my own activism and thinking about the forms of resistance. If we're going to prevent carbon lock-in, a high priority should be stopping the installation of any new fossil fuel infrastructure. That's why pipeline protests are such important forms of political action. Now, not everyone lives near a pipeline, as Bill McKibben likes to say, but everyone lives near a pot of money that's supporting fossil fuels. So my own activist energy has been going to stopping the financing of pipelines and their shaping of years to come, their lock on the future. Pension funds are a major driver of the climate crisis, with just 23 investors holding 50% of all institutional investments in fossil fuel companies. Now, most of the people I know who care about the future respond to the climate crisis by focusing on their own individual emissions, like recycling plastic or driving electric cars. But I always make the case that it's a lot harder to move billions of people's habits than it is to change 23 companies. In my own classroom, we also talk a lot about how big oil launched the mass campaign for recycling, knowing that it would distract us from other kinds of environmental action, like banning plastics. So here's Larry Thomas, former president of the Society of the Plastics Industry. "If the public thinks that recycling is working, then they are not going to be as concerned about the environment." And I think this is true. People think, oh, I recycled, therefore I did my bit for the environment. Similarly, we talk about in my class how BP is the one that invented the idea of the carbon footprint to get us to feel guilty about our own individual actions, and so shift the blame from them onto you and me. So I say keep the guilt where it should be on the relatively small number of companies still insisting on fossil fuel expansion against every warning from the IPCC. My own activist group is called TIAA-Divest. We put pressure on the $1.3 trillion pension giant TIAA, which is the major manager of retirement funds for college and university professors in the US and also nonprofits in the US. It took finance detectives months to uncover TIAA's holdings because they don't like to share them. And what they discovered was at least $78 billion in fossil fuel assets. So TIAA is financing new fossil fuel pipelines right now with faculty retirement money. Our organization is not open-ended. We have a very clear and specific goal. Our happy ending is TIAA's full divestment from fossil fuels, and we're getting there, we think. We're also linked to a lot of other organizations as part of an umbrella group called Stop the Money Pipeline. And I love this image from Stop the Money Pipeline because it gives visual form to the finance pipeline. So we see a literal pipeline funneling money. I don't know if you can see there's dollar signs there going through the pipeline to the White House, which then pumps smoke out through its chimneys and rains pollution down on the water. So the point for Stop the Money Pipeline and all of its members is to break the pipeline's vicious cycle. As I work with TIAA-Divest, in some ways I'm sticking with the spirit of most work in the humanities. That is, I'm trying to rupture a known form to usher in another world. But my formalist analysis of the pipeline has been prompting a more unfamiliar question for me. If pipelines lock us into a particular future, could they work as virtuous rather than vicious cycles? That is, could we build pipelines in ways that could lock in equality or justice for the long term? And I think the answer is yes. My example here is a very ancient form, the water pipeline. So clean water pathways are among the essential forms for collective continuance. All human groups have had to find or build pathways to bring water to and from the places where they live. Right now, of course, from Flint to Lagos, many of the world's poorest people suffer from unpredictable and unsafe water. So this is already an urgent political problem, and it's only going to get worse as the climate crisis intensifies. So is it possible to design water infrastructures for climate justice and collective continuance? Again, I think the answer is yes. My favorite examples are the forms designed by Amazigh people, often called Berbers, the indigenous people of North Africa. Water sharing in Amazigh societies is often organized around a strict timetable. And to me, this is super interesting because in the humanities, we usually associate schedules with industrial labor and prison timetables. But this example reveals other possibilities in the form of the timetable. So it's organized so that villages upstream are allocated 3 days for use of water for farming, and downstream villages have 4 days. Each village has 1 day of the week for irrigating crops, and family groups further subdivide access by hours of the day. And this works because water evaporates at different rates at different times of the day and year, so the form of the timetable affords fair distributions through periods of scarcity as well as abundance. And it blocks hoarding, which conserves water for collective continuance, so conserves water for the long period, preventing the kinds of structural deficits that we see right now, for example, along the Colorado River in the US. Berber communities have also built pipelines specifically to lock in equitable water sharing over time. Algerian Berbers, for example, have built sequences of wells along an underground channel. Moroccan Berbers have built channels that guide water down from the mountains to the plains in shapes that look like fish bones. They have kind of one main channel and then a lot of branches that go off to carry water to multiple households. Both of these forms are designed to get equal distributions of water to those who live further away or closer to the water source. Large Amazigh cities have organized water pipelines according to another form. an Islamic hierarchy. So the Prophet Muhammad insists on water sharing and says that the first priority should be given to people's drinking water, second to animals, third to farming, and fourth to industry. So in Fez, for example, one network transports drinkable water by canals to private homes and 70 public fountains. Another transports undrinkable water that's still good for cleaning and watering gardens and using in industry. And a third takes wastewater out of the city to the Cebu River. Amazigh pipelines are both just and sustainable formal models for collective continuance, which I think could provide models for communities elsewhere. And I really think we should focus on this kind of formal design, since an investment in egalitarian water pipelines could lock us into a long future of collective continuance, a virtuous rather than a vicious cycle. This claim, however, goes against one of the most deeply held political values in the humanities, which is that we should honor cultural specificity and heterogeneity and not move a solution from one place to another. It seems imperialist. And you might be thinking that it's particularly objectionable for me to be appropriating indigenous knowledge. But what strikes me most forcibly about Berber methods for distributing water equally is precisely their abstraction. Surprisingly like Foucault's prisons, that is, these communities channel water according to regular timetables and carefully arranged hierarchical distributions. These are the kinds of forms that do move across time and space because they're abstract patterns. They don't belong like other cultural practices and meanings and values do. They don't belong to a particular place and time. Now, you could, of course, say that abstract orderings of time and space are themselves confining and normalizing, which might be grounds enough for critique. But as I suggested earlier, I don't think we can make a case against a particular form as always good or bad. And now I want to turn to a third pipeline, the career pipeline for underrepresented minority populations. Although it's a more metaphorical use of the word, I would argue that the pipeline for careers is still a form. It's still an arrangement of resources. So I want to take a minute to think formally about the similarities and differences between career pipelines on the one hand and gas and water pipelines on the other. Most institutions now know that they can't just diversify a department or a team by inviting applications from minoritized people. If certain groups have been systematically excluded, discouraged, and disparaged along the way, most aren't going to reach it to the job search phase. So there needs to be attention to taking down barriers and increasing access to education and mentoring from, say, preschool onward. The goal of the career pipeline is precisely to smooth the pathway, to make it less like an obstacle course and more like an open pipe. And the idea is that this continuous flow will give shape to a more just future. So the more Black and brown professors are teaching college chemistry classes, the more Black and brown students will be able to imagine themselves doing that work, and the more will enter the profession and will mentor and smooth the way for the generations to follow. So, like the oil pipeline, the intention of the career pipeline is to lock in a specific future. And like the water pathway, to create virtuous rather than vicious cycles. And the idea is to draw so many people through these pathways that they get larger and smoother over time. I hope it's clear that in this analysis, I've been using methods I learned in literary studies. So I'm paying close attention to shapes and structures. I'm noticing differences as well as similarities across forms. And as a student of the novel, I'm especially drawn to the ways that pipelines unfold over time and shape future horizons. But I'm also interested in the literal stories we tell about pipelines, because these shape our understanding of power and agency. The story of pipeline activism can be quite dramatic and eventful, and it has a clear goal to stop the pipeline before it's in the ground. But like the pipeline itself, the story of pipeline activism is actually strangely hard to end. I don't know if you've noticed this. Sometimes it's because permits for pipelines go back and forth, and so it's not quite clear when the ending of the story is. But also when activists successfully stop a pipeline, as they do, it sometimes feels kind of uneventful. And I think this is because it's really hard to tell a great story about horrors averted. That is a bad thing that could have happened that didn't happen. In this context, I think a lot about the ozone layer. So in the 1980s, scientists, activists, and governments came together to ban chlorofluorocarbons, And they succeeded despite strong corporate opposition and misinformation. Millions of lives saved, hundreds of millions of cancers averted, agricultural disaster avoided. These are big achievements. But we don't celebrate this victory very much. My students generally don't know about it at all. And so they're mostly convinced that governments are unstoppable and climate change is hopeless. And that's partly, as I say, because I think it's hard to tell a story of horrors averted. I noticed something similar in the news just recently where Biden halted the granting of new permits for building natural gas export terminals. And I actually couldn't make any sense of this headline in the New York Times. It was Bill McKibben who pointed out that this was actually a big win for activists. So it's just an example of how we don't celebrate big wins as activist achievements. We do actually have a whole genre for telling these stories, which I've been calling activist narratives, but they don't include a lot of climate activism. And all of these, by the way, have very classic happy endings. So I think we make a mistake when we overlook the victories of activists and keep telling stories of apocalyptic hopelessness and powerlessness. And I want to end this talk not with death or resignation or open-endedness, but with a model borrowed from the happy endings of 19th century plots of precarity. My closure here is an invitation to you to join the ongoing work of fighting for collective continuance. And I just want to note that it's really interesting to me that winning doesn't require all that many people. Research shows that nonviolent revolutions over the past century have succeeded with the support of just 3.5% of the population. So you don't need to persuade everyone. You can ignore the deniers and the skeptics. We just need some organized groups willing to keep putting pressure on the relatively small number of companies really responsible for the climate crisis. We do need some more people though, and that means you. So here's some organizations that I'm inviting you to join. I think 350.org is possibly the best international umbrella organization for divestment. We love your help at TIAA-Divest, and you don't need to be a client of TIAA's to join us. And you don't need to make a huge sacrifice. An hour a month is great by all of these organizations. And what I've learned from activist stories is that we don't really need more protagonists. What we need is a lot of people just joining their voices together in a huge chorus of protest, a lot of minor characters who can take down big oil if we work together. And that's my idea of a happy ending. Thank you.